Louise Upston rejects the official advice. I mean, goes without
Oh,
saying.
cool.
$3 billion a year needed to fix child poverty. Right, let's have a bit of a look what's going on. And as we're doing this, Ricardo's finding a place for himself at the airport to sort of set up, and he's going to respond to this as well. The coalition government disagrees with advice. Strange, because they're always normally so keen to follow official advice by officials that $3 billion a year is needed to reach the country's child poverty reduction target. Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, Louise Upston, said the government was taking a different approach to the previous Labor government. She told RNZ the government was focused on growing the economy, improving health and education outcomes, and getting more households into work to bring down child poverty. So basically the neoliberal look on the world that just get off the benefit and just go and work. Just get a job. You know, this how unemployment's going up at the moment, and just go and get a job. Get yourself get yourselves out of when does that flower? I think it flowers about 3 weeks after Labor comes in, doesn't it? So what they're trying to do is build the economy and get people off benefits and get people in employed work. Rather than welfare, they say, payments and tax, rather than welfare payments and tax credit changes, which she says were pursued by the previous Labor government. Under the previous administration, a long-term goal of mid-2028 was set to reduce the number of children experiencing material hardship from 13.3% to 6%. Officials presented Upston with two alternative targets for 2028 that they believed could be achieved. However, Upston told RNZ the government, quote, disagreed with the advice and this approach as it would further entrench long-term welfare dependency and the number of children growing up in benefit-dependent households. It's funny, there's that other thing that we could start talking about at some stage. You know, that thing we talked about last week, the universal basic income, how everyone gets it and it brings kids out of poverty. That would be a plan as well. Then it wouldn't be what they say is a benefit-dependent home. She said $3 billion price tag was based on assumptions of, quote, what it would cost to carry on the previous government's approach through the changes to welfare payments and tax credits. We know the previous government approach was not working because all three primary measures of child poverty increased on its watch. In 2023, the number of children in material hardship increased by 4,100 over its 6 years. Labor tinkered with the welfare payments but did not manage the economy, which saw any progress on child poverty targets quickly erased by the cost of living crisis. I think we've got one more little bit to read before we grab Ricardo. Upston said Treasury modelling showed investments in budget 2024 towards health, education and employment are estimated to lift around 17,000 children out of poverty on all the after-housing costs, primary measured by 2026, 2027. We know this approach works because during the last 4 full years of the previous national-led government, from 2012-13 to 16-17, the number of children in material hardship fell by 56,200, she said. In a written statement, Child Poverty Action Group, those people who are kind of specifically looking for helping children in poverty, the executive officer there said they could accept ministers may have different approaches, but Upston had not provided any compelling evidence her plan would work. This is what they said. Not only has the minister rejected official advice, she has not provided any solid evidence, modelling or data that shows her chosen path will result in us meeting the 2028 goal of having child poverty. That was what she said. Of halving, sorry, I said halving child poverty. She said, I should do this. This is my problem. I've got the wrong glasses on. I should just do that. It makes it a lot easier, doesn't it? She said Upston had not only rejected official advice, she had also rejected two other specific options presented to her and instead doubled down on the more ambiguous plan of cutting taxes and growing the economy in order to lift children out of poverty. We know that ending child poverty is the right and compassionate thing to do. We have signed up as a country to halve child poverty and ensure all children have what they need to live up to their potential. The Minister of Child Poverty Reduction needs to be the greatest champion. That is what was the report through RNZ today. And let's welcome to the show from the Greens, Ricardo Menendez March. Ricardo, good evening to you, sir, and welcome.
Good evening. Straight from the
well, you obviously know the article, and if you hadn't read it yourself, you got half of it while I was there. What about just your chance for a response to what Louise Upston is saying?
I mean, frankly, it's astounding to hear the minister call her targets unrealistic, or the previous targets unrealistic, and at the same time say that investing $3 billion is completely unfeasible when the government decided to basically spend that same amount each year on tax cuts for landlords.
Yeah.
I think to me this just shows that, like with everything, how we choose to spend and invest things is our political choices, and we just need to not buy this lie from successive governments that poverty is just this thing we've got to accept when the evidence, the advice, and the solutions are there, which are things like acknowledging that we've set benefits below the poverty line. That's an absolute choice. It's not like things have to be that way. So I just think the minister's straight up not being honest when she's claiming that investing $3 billion to end child poverty is unrealistic.
It seems that the path we've chosen, I'm going back to the article now, will result in us meeting the 2028 goal of halving child poverty. Have we been on a track for that before these guys got in? Was Labor on a track to halve it? And if not, what do we need to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, so look, Labor, in our view, didn't do enough to reduce child poverty. We were always very upfront on our criticism to the Labor government when it came to addressing child poverty. Sure, the pandemic complicated things and it increased inequality, but in some ways that was part of the response from the government to the pandemic in the way that, for example, we had that two-tier benefit that meant that some families were still in poverty. The answers are actually not complicated. It looks like increasing benefits above the poverty line. It looks like extending the working families package to all caregivers, not just those in paid employment, because caregiving is work. And it looks like building more public housing. It's not like rocket science in some ways, which is almost the most depressing thing. It's relatively simple policy interventions that have been talked about for decades now. And politicians have just been too timid and too unwilling to implement those things, which is a huge shame. And the end result, we've got to remember, is beyond the statistics, it's real people's lives. It's children who are growing up in damn cold homes. It's children that are going to hospital for preventable diseases, and those costs are effectively passed on to other parts of our system, such as education, health, and eventually, many young people ending up being criminalized because of the way their upbringing ended up being.
It seems that eradicating child poverty is literally a fence at the top of the cliff. There are lots of downstream effects that'll help with that. Is that fair?
I mean, I'm going to say a very neoliberal argument, but it's an investment that pays off later down the line, if that makes sense, because we're effectively not spending all this money and then doing interventions later down the line for things we could have prevented. I mean, I think the most obvious one is health. We know that poverty is really linked to your health, and if you end up developing a series of respiratory diseases, for example, when you're really young, that could leave you with a massive health bill later down the line. But I mean, all the research also shows that like your first 3 years of life massively determine how you're going to turn up later down the line, both in terms of health and educational outcomes, etc. And so this is why making sure that we don't allow for any child to live in poverty is really important. Even for myself, I really believe that we also need to actually take a family poverty lens rather than assuming that we just talk about child poverty because children are these sort of like agentless beings who've never made a mistake and they never deserve to be in poverty, whereas the rhetoric is that somehow adults do. So my belief and the Greens believes that we shouldn't accept poverty, period, whether it's a child or an adult. But we do have this law around child poverty to measure and to have these targets, and therefore we should be committed to addressing those.
I guess if you take kids out of child poverty, then that implies the family would have to be out of poverty as well, though, eh? Is there like a double whammy there? Because you can't have the kid out of child poverty and mum and dad still being in poverty.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this
Yeah.
is why I think taking a family poverty lens is more useful. And we've got to remember that, we'll still have people who don't have children and who live in poverty. And I don't think we should tolerate and accept that either. I think, part of changing the narrative on just talking about child poverty is taking away the sort of, again, neoliberal view that people who are adults and have made choices deserve to be in poverty when actually a lot of the reasons why they're in poverty is because of policy making. It's because of higher rents that are a direct consequence of housing policies that subsequent governments have implemented. But the point being here is that yes, we should take a family poverty approach. You can't have a child out of poverty and a parent in poverty. That makes no sense.
Chewy, mate, jump in.
I think this is a really good example of a government that knows the cost of everything but the value of nothing. That they don't see, as you mentioned, those downstream effects, the lessening of pressure on our health system, the better outcomes they get in the education system that would follow them through life. But we can't look at less than 1% of our GDP and go, yeah, that's a worthwhile goal to do. It just seems so glaringly obvious. And I mean, there's people in the chat that have pointed out that Minister Upston has experience as a solo mum. And again, this is sort of hitting out at her lived experience, that somehow she's like, oh, well, I did it, so everybody can. That seems to be prevalent in this government.
I mean, it's the Paula Bennett reheated discourse, right?
Oh, yeah.
And for those of us who lived through the previous national government, we had a social development minister who kept talking about her own experience on the benefit. I think to me that also shows the limitations of lived experience, and also that we don't really know exactly what's going on in people's lives. I assume Louise Upston probably had a lot of support that allowed her to, get back up on feet and have a safety net. Obviously, we've got to remember that when she was on a benefit, the cost of living situation and equality was very different in the country. So we can't compare being on the benefit 30 years ago to now. And so yeah, I think. But to your earlier point, I agree that the saddest thing about all of this is that the evidence, the cost of not addressing child poverty is out there. And it all boils down to political choices. I mean, look, again, I go back to my comment about how the government is saying spending $3 billion on child poverty is unrealistic when they've spent the same amount basically on tax cuts for landlords. Yeah. I think that just talks to me about a government that's got its priorities upside down. And I got asked earlier today, by journalists, wouldn't some of these tax cuts trickle down to to people in poverty, as if though we haven't gone down through that same argument and those same issues again and again since the 80s, this idea that the tax cuts will trickle down and suddenly landlords are going to cut their rent by half. It didn't happen before, it doesn't happen in other countries, and it won't happen here either.
Do you think that when there's stories about this, putting just a raw dollar amount on this, hey, look, if we spend this, we solve child poverty, that your average person's mind just goes to pouring a big bucket of money at the problem rather than looking at things that could help that, like looking at market rents, looking at the cost of childcare, the cost of doctor's visits, all of those things that would all go towards improving that poverty situation for people, as you said, not just children, but anyone in that poverty cycle. It's not just giving them a wad of 50s and going, you got it from here, buddy, ruffle the hair, on you go.
I agree, and it's a matter of doing both, right? It's like we've got to lift incomes above the poverty line, and at the same time, I think, too, you're completely right around some of those other interventions and hard discussions we have to have around, why is it that we allow for unlimited rent increases each year? Why is it that there isn't enough public housing? Why is it that general practitioners are treated as a business as opposed to a core public good? Those are all interventions we have to make. At the same time, we also can't ignore that boosting incomes does have that immediate relief and material difference. So I think it's a bit of both. And at the same time, I also think we do talk about pouring a bunch of money onto other parts of our political infrastructure, like the transport, government, how it's about the billions of dollars you're spending on roads. And so why can't we do the same for poverty? Why can't governments proudly do a stand-up saying They've just invested, billions of dollars in addressing child poverty in the same way they talk about a bloody road. But at the same time, I do think you're right that where the more transformational interventions will go will be on things like no longer treating housing as a commodity and as a public good, and equally not treating parts of the healthcare system as a business profit. We've got to do both things.
We've been talking in the last week or so, Ricardo, based on a story we did last week, again, about a UBI. How could a UBI fit into this scenario to help out with children / people in poverty?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a, we've got, in the Greens, we've got our version called a guaranteed minimum income, which kind of acknowledges that there's kind of different top ups we would have to do for things like for caregivers, disabled people, etc. I think a UBI or a guaranteed minimum income only works if you set the baseline above the poverty line. This is why I was critical of other political parties who came out with the UBI, because it was really well below the poverty line, and then that's just middle class welfare because it basically assumes your job plus that UBI. What I'm really a fan of is UBS, which is Universal Basic Services, which is what Chewy was kind of talking about when it came to general practice and other things, which is this idea that we have a list of basic services, and those get treated as free public services and not profit, and we invest into them, via tax reform, etc. And I think to me that kind of goes back to that notion of we can't just keep pouring money into things that are basically for profit, because those people that control those services just can hike up the cost of literal living. So I think to me it's a bit of a kind of UBI plus UBS to really kind of nail all parts of the system.
Excellent. Hey, before you go, maybe you could give us a bit of an exclusive. What's the word on the waka jumping conversation around Darling Tana? Anything you guys talking about? Because I know it's sort of been approved by the members at the moment. Has there been anything else said?
Well, the latest development, and I'm probably going to give a boring answer because we're still sifting through the sort of consequences of the court decision. But as you'll know, the court basically ruled in our favor as of Friday. And over the past few days, what we've been doing is just mulling over exactly how we're going to move forward. And there's a few things to consider here. But basically, our intentions remain the same in that we don't think Darling should be an MP. And so we're finding ways to kind of act post the court ruling to kind of see what we can do to basically stick to our principles that we talked about before she took us to court.
Ricardo, I think you need to take some lessons from the National Party as to how not to answer a question, because you just gave us a very, very good answer, and we now are more informed that you're supposed to say things like, well, what's said around our table doesn't get shared outside of that room, and you didn't do it. So I don't know, maybe Mr. Luxon.
I think I gave you a pretty generic answer for what it's worth.
It's still something. It's nice. It's good to know.
Yeah.
What I hear.
We also want to be transparent and upfront.
When we started hearing about this, I was kind of the opinion that, I don't know, because the Greens were so keen not to do the waka jumping thing, when it originally came out pretty strongly against it. Are you really going to waste it on this? Because it's not going to make any difference in Parliament. So I to hear you say that you're still looking for kind of your original co-offer and how to work through that, it's nice to hear. It's nice to hear someone with some, can't think of the word, Chewy, morals, standing by what they say. So it's good.
And we've got to remember this is a unique situation to the ones that many of the people who posted were contemplating, right? And I think that's why I think the situation is unique. But well, thank you. Look, we tried to, we genuinely have been trying to be as transparent as we can through a very messy process. So yeah, I'm sure you'll hear about this in the coming
first. Will we hear about it first? That's all we want to know. We'll get it first. Yeah. Yeah. I'll take that as a yes. I'll take that as a yes. Hey, Ricardo, thanks for joining us tonight, mate. Thanks for giving us some time as you're landing. We appreciate it, man.
No worries.
All right.
Have a good night.
Thanks, mate.
Bye.
Sounds like we got an exclusive on the way, Chewy. Did you get that as well?
Yeah, definitely. That is what I think they call in the biz a rock solid verbal contract.